Well, good afternoon. My name is Mary Briggs, Senior Director of Research and Education Policy Development here at the California School Boards Association. We want to welcome you today to our webinar on trauma-informed education, what governance teams need to know. CSBA has been really tracking the requests of our members for resources and information around what they can do in their role as board members to support students, staff, and families as they navigate a lot of the challenges in the current climate. And so this webinar is in part a response to that need that has been identified by our members. And it's been sponsored and supported through the generous support of the Stewart Foundation. So today we are excited to bring you a panel of incredible educators who are doing work that is specific to this topic. And it is going to be moderated by author and educator Alex Shevrin Venet. So she will be kind of leading us through our webinar today, which will begin with a presentation about trauma-informed education, as well as, leading into a panel discussion, and we will have time for question and answers at the end. On the next slide, you're going to see a couple of housekeeping items. At the end, we will have, as I mentioned, a Q&A segment where we will try our best to answer your questions. We do want you to notice down at the bottom that if you would like to submit questions, please use the section that is called Q&A. It is much easier to track the questions so that we can respond to those in that form versus the chat. So use that Q&A in lieu of the chat, and they'll either be answered live as part of the presentation, or we have the option of responding within the Q&A section as well. We do want to let you know now that all attendees and folks who have registered for this presentation will receive a link to the video of the webinar as well as the slides. So those will be available for you as a resource. They'll probably go out within 24 to 48 hours of the webinar. But now I want to hand this over to our illustrious moderator. I was just saying as we were preparing that, her book had come in handy for me as we were working through issues during the pandemic. But we think that you're going to appreciate the fact that this is an opportunity for us to talk about trauma-informed education, really specifically attending to that governance team role today. So thank you, Alex, and I'll let you take it away from here.
All right. Hi, everyone. It is great to be here with you today. I am so excited for our conversation, and I love this topic, and I am excited to talk about it with you. I'm Alex. I use she, her pronouns. I am Zooming at you from Winooski, Vermont, where today it was kind of warm and sunny, but on Thursday it's going to snow quite a lot. I am an educator. I've taught in 7 through 12 alternative school, community college. I teach after school, 4th and 5th grade, and I am a teacher educator. I teach in-service teachers on topics of equity and trauma-informed education, and I am a professional development facilitator, and I am a writer. I have a book called Equitycentered Trauma-Informed Education and another one that I'm working on. All of this work centered around how do we help educators create schools that are human-centered, responsive, and caring places for all students. I have an amazing panel with me today. We're going to meet them in just a little bit. But first, if we're going to talk about trauma-informed education, we're going to model it a little bit as well. So in a trauma-informed paradigm, we want to make sure that we're showing up as our full selves. So we always get started to with some getting ready to learn things. So we're going to do two things. The first is taking a moment to check in with yourself. I'm going to turn off my camera for about 30 seconds. I invite you to take those 30 seconds and maybe use a suggestion on the screen or do something else that just helps you maybe shake off the day you've had so far and get settled in this present moment. So I'll call us back together in just about 30 seconds. All right, we'll come back together. The second thing that we do to get ourselves ready to learn is to make sure we feel connected with other folks that we are learning with. And I got to be a little goofy with it sometimes. So I have a Baby Yoda Grogu check-in board. If you can use the chat, which I am, now that I'm saying it, I'm not 100% sure that you can. I would just invite you to take a look and see what's your mood today. What are you feeling like? You know, for me, I think I'm feeling like maybe a 5. Is that sort of like feeling a little relaxed, but maybe also a little tired, like that little snuggly in my coat feels very appealing to me. If you are able to use the chat and you want to drop into it what number you are feeling like today, you can go ahead and do that. If it is not working, which it might not be, then just take a moment here and check in with yourself. What are you feeling like? What's your mood? I think we probably don't have access to the chat, but I'll just say as a little, meta note about these kinds of check-ins. There's a whole variety of check-ins you can do at the start of meetings, at the start of learning experiences. And even though sometimes they're a little silly or feel a little vulnerable, just that little moment of slowing down and connecting as people, it can be really powerful. We rush past it way too often. So always encourage you to take those times to check in. Lastly, before we dive in, I would like to encourage you all to take what you need. I mean this in a couple of ways. One is that we're going to be talking about trauma today. That can be activating, right? That can stir things up. If you find that it's too much for you today, remember this is being recorded. You can always leave and come back to it another time. Encourage you that if you're feeling really stirred up, reach out to those who are in your support network. And also just encourage you to take what you need in terms of the content. We're going to be going over a lot of things in a short amount of time. And so I hope that you find some things that feel useful to you. And lastly, if you need to take breaks, get water. If you're currently sitting, but you'd rather be laying down on your couch or watching while you pace around your office, we're on Zoom. I can't see you. Do what you need to do to feel comfortable and engaged today. All right. So with that, we are going to dive in. Today's topic is trauma-informed education. And one thing you're going to hear me say a couple of times is this is a big topic. It's complicated, and there are a lot of different perspectives on trauma-informed education. So my hope today is to give you the tools that you need to engage in conversations about trauma-informed education in your work, and the tools that you need to ask good questions. So we are going to go through some foundational topics, and then we'll dive into some more detail with our panel. So to talk about trauma-informed education, first we have to talk about what trauma is. You would think that this would be really simple to define, but alas, it is not. Pretty much anyone you ask to define trauma is going to define it in a slightly different way, because so many fields of study and experiences lead to how we understand trauma. People talk about trauma from a neuroscience perspective. People talk about trauma from a sociological perspective. These words that are on the side here reference different conceptualizations or types of trauma, some of which blend together, some of which conflict. And so the definition I have here is an attempt to encompass a lot of these different pieces, which is that trauma can be both an individual and or a collective response to life-threatening events, harmful conditions, or prolonged, dangerous, or stressful environments. So trauma can be caused by one-time events that you might think of as being particularly dangerous or unusual, a natural disaster, an accident, but trauma can also be caused by surviving through a great deal of stress every day, or not feeling safe on a consistent basis. Different people dig into these different other elements of trauma, like historical trauma looks at how trauma is passed down and transmitted through generations, with particular attention to how that shows up in communities impacted by colonialism or oppression. Developmental trauma looks at how trauma impacts a growing child. There are lots of different ways that we might look at this issue. And so as you are talking to folks about trauma in your schools, a great piece to start with is to ask how they're defining trauma, what understandings they might have about what trauma is. So in this definition, you see that trauma is a response. That's mostly generally agreed upon, is that trauma is a response to these events or conditions rather than the event or condition itself. My example is, if you think about being at the beach, you're at the ocean, you wade into the water, and then a huge wave comes along, pulls you underneath, and the undertow is kind of jerking you around. If you are a 21-year-old surfer bro, and this happens to you all the time, and you took a surf class, and so you have some training, and you have, a bunch of your bros when you get out of the water, going to be like, sick wave, that was awesome. You might have experienced that as stressful, but you might not have experienced it as trauma. It might not have been overwhelming. It might not have touched at your core feeling of safety as a person. Now, if you are 3 years old and this is your first time at the beach and you only kind of know how to swim from swim lessons in a pool, and you also don't have the context to really make sense of that momentary feeling of a lack of safety, then this might be a traumatic moment. Trauma isn't the wave. Trauma is your response to being in that wave. Our responses can vary based on all kinds of things, just pieces about our individual temperament and personality and how we make sense of the world, the context around us, protective factors like the community support that we have, access to resources, how we process things. So although not all stress is trauma, what becomes trauma isn't always very clear. This is why you might see two students who are siblings might have responded to the same experience in their home in different ways. This is why you might see different people in a school respond differently to a crisis that impacted the whole school. So one important thing as we talk about trauma is that we can't ever really know for someone else whether they are experiencing something as trauma. And we're going to talk in a minute about the idea of being universal rather than labeling particular people as having experienced trauma. So we're really embracing this idea that it's different for different people. Now, if you do experience an event or conditions as trauma, you can have a whole range of responses to that. Take a second and just look over all the words on this slide. You might notice some things that sort of ring a bell for you of things you've heard about trauma before, like depression, anger, health problems, challenges with relationships. You might also notice some words here like a strong sense of justice, an increased coping capacity, stronger relationships, personal growth. One thing that's really important is that people impacted by trauma they're not just one thing, right? Trauma can be incredibly painful and disruptive. And at the same time, trauma can also facilitate growth and meaning. Those two things don't cancel each other out, they coexist. And so when we talk about people experiencing trauma, it's really important to hold that coexisting. We want to stay away from narratives that position people who've experienced trauma as damaged or broken, right? Because people aren't damaged or broken. They're people, right? They're experiencing something. We also want to stay away from narratives about this person overcame their trauma. They're such a hero. Look at how great they're doing because they grew after all this. What is more common is that people are humans and humans are messy and we have all kind of a range of experiences. So we want to just hold that any or all of these things could be present in the same person at the same time. So this is sort of the like I said, really big picture of what is trauma. We're going to now shift a little bit into, okay, if all of this range of experiences, range of responses could be connected to trauma, then what does trauma-informed education mean? To do that, we have to go back and talk about how the phrase trauma-informed itself came about. And this really traces back to the idea that although trauma as a concept has been around forever, the way that we mostly talk about trauma these days really grew out of the activism of Vietnam War veterans and women survivors of domestic and sexual violence who really advocated for themselves to be taken seriously, that their emotional pain and harm was just as real as physical pain and harm, and that they deserved treatment and they deserved support around their trauma. Through their activism, they were able to really bring this into the mainstream. Connected to that advocacy, then folks started to think about, okay, we're taking this as a concept. Now, how do we transform the services and systems so that we're responsive to this trauma? So the phrase trauma-informed really came about with how do we articulate, based on knowing that trauma is real, how do we shift our doctor's office or our counseling services or the VA so that we're being responsive. Some of the principles that were articulated around this were around safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. Those have remained really core principles in many different frameworks of trauma-informed practice. From there, trauma-informed care has really taken off and grown into a lot of different modalities and locations. Trauma-informed care can be found as a framework in mental health field, in medicine, in education, as we're going to talk about today. I was just reading a paper about trauma-informed approaches to theater performance. So people are really applying this in many different places. Now, something that's important to know is that although maybe this phrase and principles were created by a couple of folks at a certain time, the umbrella of trauma-informed is actually very large and has grown to encompass many, many things. So a lot of folks are doing work specifically around a framework of trauma-informed medicine or trauma-informed education that has specific elements to it. Other folks are doing practices that maybe aren't connected to a framework, but are informed by and responsive to that deep understanding of trauma. The umbrella really holds a lot of different things. And so that leads me to this question of, is there someone that owns trauma-informed education, right? Because in your work, you may hear about different programs or frameworks in schools that are owned by a specific corporation or a curriculum, published curriculum, and they need to be purchased and they need to be implemented with fidelity. You may hear those types of things. Trauma-informed education is not one of those. Nobody owns trauma-informed education. There are many frameworks of it. There are also some different words that you're going to hear instead of trauma-informed education. You might hear trauma-responsive education, trauma-sensitive education. Closely related are things like healing-centered education. And so there are many different folks who are connected to this overall idea that we want to be responsive to trauma, but are coming at it from different angles. To me, this is a great thing because it means that we can really embrace all of the wisdom and all of these different pieces, folks working from different corners and coming together to make schools that are more caring and more human-centered. The challenge is that when you hear someone say trauma-informed education, you might not always know exactly what they're talking about. And so the same way that I said, ask somebody what they mean when they say trauma, definitely ask people what they mean when they say trauma-informed education. If someone comes to you with a proposal or at public comment, or, you're working on policy, make sure that you understand what framework of trauma-informed education are they talking about, if they're talking about a specific one at all, what's encompassed, what are the types of things that they think are connected to this. And so you want to be clear about that, because if we assume we're working from a particular framework, we just might be missing some opportunities to understand. So all of that being said, what I'm going to share next are some definitions and principles of trauma-informed education that come out of my work, which draws on many other people's work. But I'm just giving you that asterisk that this is how I'm defining it. And again, I encourage you all that if this topic is of interest, if it's coming up in your community, look into some of the other frameworks that are available, look into how your community is defining this. So, let's dive in. Trauma-informed education, in my definition, has three parts: that educators in schools are addressing the impact of trauma that has already happened, we're preventing trauma inside our schools, and we're disrupting the causes of future trauma. So that addressing means that we recognize that students, teachers, and other members of the school community have already experienced trauma, and we're thinking about how to transform our schools to be responsive to that. The second piece is preventing trauma inside of our schools, because as much as we would like them to be, schools are not in a magical bubble force field inside of which there's only lollipops and rainbows, right? Schools can be really challenging places. There's violence in schools, there's racism in schools, there's transphobia in schools, there's humans in schools, and humans harm each other. And so we want to do what we can to prevent children, adults, all community members from experiencing trauma inside of our schools. And then finally, we also want to see how trauma can be disrupted through the work that we do in education. So this is where we connect to sort of that bigger purpose of education. How are we equipping students to be good citizens, to disrupt harm, to heal harm as they go through life? How could it's sort of my pie in the sky vision, right? Is how could we create a less traumatic world through our work with kids today? So all three of those pieces are connected to trauma-informed education. Another important piece to note is that trauma-informed education is about universal, proactive, and whole school shifts. So we're not identifying certain students who we think have experienced trauma and saying, you kids get the trauma-informed stuff and everybody else is just going to do business as usual. Instead, everybody's involved. We're thinking about strategies and things that might support everyone, students and adults who have already experienced trauma, those who might, those who we don't know. Connected, though, is trauma-specific practices. So within a trauma-informed ecosystem, you also are going to have students and teachers and other members of the community who have identified that they have experienced trauma and who need something specific. They might need some additional support. In general, teachers are not going to be leading a trauma-specific plan. So trauma-informed education does not mean that teachers must become counselors or therapists. What it does mean is that teachers might collaborate with counselors or therapists, taking their lead or taking the lead of a student or taking the lead of their family or a community healer and being supportive. So for example, maybe you have a student who experienced a house fire and is working with an individual counselor outside of school to support them through the trauma of losing their home. The teacher does not need to unpack that kid's emotions with them. The teacher does not need to understand how to heal a person from trauma. The teacher doesn't need to become a clinician. What the teacher might need to do is hear some communication from that outside counselor that says, hey, we've identified in our work together that this student needs some extra quiet time during the school day. Can you help us think about how we could build that in? So the teacher is really coming from their role and their expertise, which is designing learning, structuring the school day, all of those things, and being responsive. Teachers don't need to know all of the details. They might not even know the specific thing that that student is working through. They are simply collaborating. So trauma-specific is an element of trauma-informed, but I just want to be clear that we're not expecting people who aren't mental health counselors to become mental health counselors. So connected to that proactive element, there are a lot of ways to think about being proactive in trauma-informed practices. One way that we can think about this is a framework I have called 4 Priorities of Trauma-Informed Decision-Making. This is really built around the idea that from all of the research and practice on trauma, we know that there are some things that generally support people who've already experienced trauma and also can be very settling to everybody. Those things are predictability, because trauma can make us feel that the world is very unpredictable. Flexibility, because to feel our feelings and to heal and to survive, we need the flexibility of others and we need to take things a moment at a time. Connection, because relationships are healing and it can be a challenge to build and maintain relationships after trauma. And they are one of the most important factors in buffering future trauma. And empowerment, which doesn't just mean feeling good about yourself, but means literally having power and using it. So how can I regain my sense of control? How do I feel like I matter and I affect things around me? And so one way that people implement trauma-informed practice proactively is by thinking through a frame like this and applying it to things like in the classroom. How am I fostering these things? You can also apply it to policy, right? If I'm looking at the policy around lateness in the morning, how are we creating a policy that is predictable and fair, but also has some flexibility that fosters relationships rather than making kids and families feel targeted or ostracized if they're having trouble getting to school on time? And how do we build in empowerment so that people feel that they have agency and they have control in the process of responding to maybe patterns of being late? And we can talk more about that when we get to the panel pretty soon. So a frame like this is helping to create proactive infusing trauma awareness into our decisions. That proactive work around classrooms or policies is not the only thing we need to pay attention to, though. In my work, I talk about trauma-informed education as necessarily being equity-centered, meaning that inequity causes trauma, and when people experience trauma, they often face inequities in accessing education. And so we have to really blend our conversations about equity and trauma in schools. And so connected to that, I talk about how trauma-informed education has to be anti-racist and anti-oppression because racism and oppression cause trauma. And so we need to center that work in reducing and ending trauma. And also being mindful of how racism and oppression influence people's ability to access resources and heal. We're being asset-based. So what I said before about seeing people as whole humans and not having a savior mentality or trying to do things for them, we're working from people's strengths. We're being systems-oriented. So recognizing that it can't just be up to individual teachers, it really has to be a whole community effort, and we need to make systems change. Being human-centered, so always coming back to the person, the people involved. Universal and proactive, so not waiting until after a crisis has happened to say, now we need trauma-informed education, but recognizing that we live in a traumatic world, so the time to implement this all is right now. And social justice focused, so really being aware of that longer, bigger picture. How could we actually bring more justice through this work? So within all this, what are the types of things that people might be seeking to change through their efforts with trauma-informed education? What might you see advocates wanting to bring to you? What might they be organizing around? There's really a whole range. And again, this can be connected as well to our different definitions and where people are focused. But a lot of trauma-informed advocates are really wanting to change discipline practices and disparities in discipline, recognizing that traditional ways that we respond to behavior and harm in our schools are trauma-inducing, not trauma-informed. A lot of trauma-informed advocates are wanting to look at the trauma of all kinds of oppression on students and schools, and so are seeking to understand how that's impacting people and to make our schools responsive to that. Trauma-informed advocates are looking to enhance school community because we know that connectedness is so helpful. So really looking at school culture, relationships, how students are feeling heard and seen. People are looking at mental health and well-being of students, teachers, staff, the whole community. People are also looking at working conditions. So especially now recognizing that teachers' working conditions can be trauma-inducing, especially in the face of teacher shortages and the public narrative about teachers right now, really looking at labor practices being pretty intertwined with all of this work. And then policies at all the levels, which we're going to talk about more in a moment, really recognizing that if I'm in the classroom and I want to be the most trauma-informed teacher in the world, I'm still going to run up against some policies that might be harming my students or preventing them from actually showing up as their full selves. And so really looking to shift policies as well. So I just took you through a very lot of things in quite a crash course, but I'm so excited to now slow down a little bit and welcome our wonderful panelists who are going to come together to really dig in a little more to what this looks like, what their experiences have been, and hopefully give you all some ideas about what you can do in your roles. So I'm going to stop sharing so you can see us all, and I will invite my panelists here. And we're just going to start by having them each introduce themselves. So whichever one of you would like to jump in first, you could go ahead, introduce yourself. And I would love for you to just talk a little bit about how trauma-informed practices show up in your work, how you're kind of connected to this concept.
I can first start off by just introducing myself. My name is Patrick Harris. I am in my 8th year in education, which feels so, fun to say now. I am currently a middle school English teacher. I'm also a dean of students, and I am the author of a memoir and reflection tool called The First Five, a love letter to teachers, which is a book geared towards new teachers in our profession.
And can you tell us how you connect to this concept of trauma-informed education?
Absolutely. So I was like taking so many notes while you were talking. Really, my work is really around helping teachers and new teachers, right? Like see themselves as full human beings, right? Because what we're seeing and what my experience has been over the last 8 years, right, is that I could not do the work of trauma-informed education until I unpacked my own trauma and saw myself as a full human being, right? And so really what my work is around is helping teachers to do the work of reflection in their own stories, right? So that they can better understand the work that happens around them and with them to be able to make better decisions as we continue to impact students.
Beautiful. Thank you.
I can go next. My name is Oriana Ides. I'm in Oakland, California. I've had the pleasure, the honor of working in public schools for about 18 years. So directly out of public school as a student myself into after school programs. And then I became a teacher. And after about 11 years as a teacher, I went to school to become a therapist. And I was hearing a lot of conversation amongst my coworkers, my fellow teachers around trauma. And I wanted to really better understand what that meant. And in going through my program, I saw that there was a lot of misunderstandings around what it meant to be trauma-informed or healing-centered. And I do love how that was about 8 years ago. I love how the conversation has grown and expanded over the years. I am currently with a nonprofit organization called the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Project. And we are trying to uplift the needs, voices, assets, powerful work of educators, so anyone tending to the wellness of young people, so that we can seize this opportunity to create healing spaces, opportunities to connect with our humanity, and to engage in our own healing work in a way to better protect and provide for our young people, their families, and the communities that the schools are situated within. And so that's just a little bit about me.
Thank you. And I just want to shout out the work of the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Center. You all offer such beautiful and I believe mostly free and really accessible professional learning for educators. We can add that as a resource for all of you. I would highly encourage to pass along to your colleagues and educators you work with to check out. Angela.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation, Alex. And I'm really happy to be here with Patrick and Oriana and to learn from you and with you. My name is Angela Arsenault. I am the board chair for the Champlain Valley School District here in Vermont. It is the largest school district in Vermont at about 4,000 students, which, says a lot about the size of Vermont, maybe, and systems in Vermont. But I am also actually zooming in from the State House in our capital, Montpelier. As of this past November, I am a state representative representing my town, Williston. and really excited to bring a trauma-informed, hopefully, to, if I can consider myself gaining in that category, I think, but bring that lens to the State House as well. I was lucky enough, I think it was 2020, that I took I attended one of Alex's webinars, and I was just excited instantly at like everything that Alex was saying resonated with me, and felt like giving voice and name to the things that I'd been feeling and sensing and not really being able to articulate as far as my concerns with some of the ways that we were approaching policy work as a board. And so now I pay really close attention to trying to set that to model it, I suppose, for our board, knowing that, as Patrick was saying, there's so much that has to come from on a personal level before you can show up, ready to be equity-centered, trauma-informed, and work in a collective, especially a collective that works in public view. That adds an interesting layer to board work. And people get really nervous about being vulnerable, and we can get into all of that, but I'm just trying to model that lens and behavior as I approach my work on the school board.
Thank you all. So much wisdom here. I wish we had like 4 hours to talk. So we're going to try to pack as much in as we can during the time we have. I want to start us off by talking about how school boards and also just in general policy work can be supportive of folks who are trying to implement trauma-informed practice. So really thinking about how educators are often really concerned with that day-to-day work, showing up for students, the day-to-day, all the million things we have to do in school. I'm curious, from each of your experience, how can school boards and the policy work that they do be supportive to those educators, or maybe some of the ways that they haven't been so supportive that to this group of folks engaging, you would think that they can learn something from. So how can school boards and their policy work be supportive of that day-to-day work? And whoever feels ready to dive in, you can go for it.
I guess I would say, I wonder if I've been really interested in lately in kind of establishing a baseline that says we have to center students, period, and understand how important the health of our educators is to the health and well-being of our students. And it maybe goes without saying that we're all coming out of and existing in, morphing through an extended traumatic experience with the pandemic, political environment being what it is, the social environment cultural environment being what it is. We have to be mindful of, as has already been said, the ways in which our educators are arriving at work, and then working with them in a trauma-informed way. And I think about that often as we set policy as a board. It can feel very removed from the people who are actually going to be implementing the policy. And so we've been trying to find ways to involve more direct stakeholders, if you will, in the formation of policy. And I think that's kind of that's like a new starting point that I'm interested in. And it gets a little bit at trauma-informed because it's just, I think there's a need for acknowledgement that we're all hurting, and then to go from there.
I love that. And part of what I'm hearing you say is trying to move the baseline from a place of, oh, we can make policy decisions and maybe we'll ask people what they think. And instead moving the baseline to, we always involve the educators in the policy choices. Patrick.
So I'm gonna start big picture and kind of work my way down. I think that we kind of have to really think about the portrait of a graduate, right? When we're talking about trauma-informed care, how are students who spend the majority of their childhoods in a school building, how they matriculate through and become whole, healthy human beings is on us and our policies and what we do every single day, right? And so we have to get clear about how we are including creating conditions and what our great vision is, right, for mental health of our students. Our students have told us across the country that, and they've been saying it, but especially since the pandemic, that it is a great concern of theirs that adults who claim to be educators on every level are not paying close attention to their mental health, right? So we have to take a step back as school board leaders and think about, where does that fit in, right, into our actual portrait of a graduate, right? That piece is crucial. Number two, I think if we're going to talk about human-centered work, right, then we got to see school board members in schools, right? Like, I think one of the biggest frustrations for me as a newer teacher, right, is when there will be a crowd of school board members who would tour my classroom, and that was one time throughout the year. And I remember feeling the stress of that. I remember feeling like just a teacher, and that the entire school and what was happening on that day and what was going to happen in the district depended on that 5 to 7 minute observation, right? I didn't think that my school board members knew who I was, knew what I was facing, knew what school was like for me, knew what trauma I had sort of endured and kind of came through and overcome and still working through, and how that was impacting the ways in which I was addressing my job as a teacher every single day. I didn't know that my school board members knew me, right? And so how school board members are making the time to show up and build relationships with staff members, on top of, as my friend Angela said, creating those conditions where they are creating formal structures to hear people before they make policy, is crucial, right? So we got to start at the portrait of a graduate to ensure that we're including that mental health component, and then we got to get it. We need y'all in schools, right, on a regular basis to ensure that you can put the human in human centered.
Much of what I was thinking and feeling has been already shared, but I just want to uplift that I don't think there's any more difficult work in the world than being an educator, to being a classroom teacher. And on top of that, it is incredibly under-resourced and misunderstood. And so the need to be on campus and really integrated into the working lives of educators is crucial, to feel like people that are not in our school spaces get to make decisions on our behalf and on behalf of our young folks can feel really disrespectful and can create, all kinds of dynamics. And, I don't, medical decisions, I'm not in that world, but I don't think people are making, decisions that doctors have to make that have not experienced being a doctor or have some medical knowledge. And so just to think about that's happening in education is really mind-blowing to me, and always has been. And so, I think one thing to kind of also think about is the way that safety is relative. And so I have what feels safe to me very clearly. I've spent time thinking about it and exploring and defining it, but each person, based on your lived experience, based on so many dynamics, define safety for themselves. And many of our schools do not feel safe. And I think that really listening into and creating spaces for students and educators and families to define safety and then create that safe space is really important.
I'm like, I have to refocus on my questions because I'm getting so invested in what you all are talking about and taking my own notes. I want to pick up on this thread that Patrick and Oriana were just speaking, well, all three of you were really speaking about, which is board members really seeking to deepen their understanding of what is actually happening in school and what is the true lived experience of educators and students. And I want to connect this to policy and ask particularly you two, and of course, Angela, chime in if you have thoughts as well, but about, as an educator, can you share an example of how policy really impacts you and your students in the classroom or has in the past? Because I do think that sometimes when you have that remove, even if the intentions are good, I think about a friend of mine who asked the question, what's the worst consequence of your best idea? And so I'm curious about how policy has maybe influenced your students' well-being, their access to support around trauma, or your well-being as an educator.
I can say a little bit about that. I think what comes to mind when I hear that question is policy is just one very important factor in creating an educational structure and experiences that are not trauma-inducing or that are healing-centered. And so I've seen really well-intentioned policy be implemented, but the values maybe of folks holding space were not aligned or clearly defined, or deep understanding of educators' skill set or the resources or the school culture or community assets. So all of that, I think, needs to be deeply considered when creating policy and when supporting school spaces and upholding policy. Here in the districts I've been a part of, we had this beautiful community organizing, parents, young folks organized with a community organization to stop willful defiant suspension. And there was just such powerful intention in that. But there was a huge a number of missed opportunities in bringing that disruption to actual school campuses. We did not have the skill set or the resources or the values to actually hold young people that were resisting what school had to offer. And we didn't take into account the historical legacy of schooling in many of our historically targeted communities. And so that was I think disastrous in some ways, and harmful to the entire community that witnessed young people, being able to really set the tone and culture of a school, not as their best selves. Right. And because the school didn't allow them to be their best selves. And then another one I just also want to mention is here we put a tremendous amount of funding towards the African American Male Achievement Program, which was, again, incredibly beautiful and necessary. But it missed something, because what I saw it doing is positioning the reasons why schools were struggling on this one population of young folks, on Black boys in our district. And it didn't include professional development or skill building for really racist institutions to get better or interrupt that racism. So I'll stop there. But
I think one thing that it's really coming to mind is in the state of Michigan, and they're currently trying to repeal this, and is that it is a state law that if a third grader is not reading at grade level, then they must be retained, right? And there are many exemptions that sort of really that where there haven't been a significant amount, right, of third graders who have indeed been retained. However, the law is still intact. And what I find very interesting about that policy and many policies like it is that so many or so often our framework in education is so punitive, right? Like it's very discipline focused. It's or else, right? Like you do this or else you're gonna endure this particular punishment, right? And so while there hasn't been a ton of third graders actually retained, that does not mean that the stress level of what we've had to endure as teachers to feel the pressure of that is actually addressed, right? And so what these kind of policies do, and even just the discourse of them, right? The passage is a whole other thing, is that, we are not really, we oftentimes are like, well, this is not really solving the issue, right? Putting this kind of or else policy in place. And instead, right, there are whole communities that could be impacted by this particular law, right? From a bird's eye view, it makes sense, right? When you're looking at numbers and you're trying to just get third graders to read, it makes sense. But when you take a little closer look and when you talk and discuss with teachers, right, and students, right, the impact of that particular law, we know that just because you put it in writing, just because you say or else does not mean that it'll actually change things, right? And so what can we do to kind of rid of the or else policies and really begin to have conversations? What would it look like to have a school system nationwide, right, that is not punitive or punishment focused, but it instead unlocks doors for endless possibility?
Oh, I hope someone just wrote down the quote you just said, because that was good. I like that. My mind is connecting so many things, and I think I want to thread something to you, Angela, because part of what I pull out from what Patrick and Oriana just said is around that school change is complex, and not all problems actually need a policy right now in order for the change to happen. And Oriana, in your example of the community organizing, it sounds in some ways like the timing of that policy or the language of the policy actually didn't really align with the goals of the organizing movement that was happening. And so I'm just thinking about this idea that a school board, a governance team has this role maybe of creating or advising in a policy way, but sometimes maybe a supportive move is to actually say, we're not ready to put a policy around this, or maybe we don't have what we need to do this yet, or we need to work with the folks who are really driving this change to understand if a policy would even be helpful. So I'm curious from you, Angela, if that resonates at all with conversations you've had as a board member, and maybe what the role of slowing down looks like as a school board.
Yes. Oh, resonates. And I can actually think of multiple examples, and the understandable drive to create positive change, as I loved how Oriana described those efforts, as beautiful. Like there can be beauty in something that is very misguided. And you have to take the time to realize that it's misguided rather than like just trying to push forward with the beauty of it. And I think of in 2019, it was our students who came to us, our high school students, who came to the board wanting to raise the Black Lives Matter flag. And we realized we didn't have a flag policy. And we had to work through as a board, do we want to kind of whip a policy up? And of course we have a standard. It's going to take at least a month to 2 months just to let you know there's the reading of the policy at one meeting, and then the warning, and there are things in place to structures in place to intentionally slow the process down. But even then we were trying to like, well, how fast could we do this? And what we ended up doing in the first few months was hearing from students, hearing from administrators at the high school, and taking board action, which is different from a policy. And it was in the absence of policy, we're going to allow this, and then we're going to work on the policy. And months later, we had a policy crafted. It was still imperfect. And a few months after that, we passed it. And then a few months later, we updated it. But I think that willingness to act outside of policy is important, and I think is scary to a lot of board members, because there's that like some level of safety, I think, in, oh, well, this is what we do. This is what we're supposed to do. This is what we're going to do. And I have found in just the, 4 short years that I've been a board member, there are many, many times when actually allowing or asking people within our schools to come up with procedures, say, instead of a policy. While we work on the policy, are there procedures that would be helpful? Are there guidelines that would be helpful? And those don't necessarily come from the board. In fact, they rarely come from the board. If, they should be coming from the people who will be, the people who know, as Oriana was saying, like when you really zoom out, like how ridiculous it is that you don't have to be an educator to be on a school board. You don't have to have any special kind of training. We are well-intentioned community members representing what we believe are the interests of our communities. So yes, it is very important to slow down, and that takes a lot of communication. It takes a lot of understanding, and actually a little bit of faith in the process outside of the process, that you can guide yourselves, I think, as board members, using the wisdom of all the folks in your schools to find possibly a better path than you could just by like fast tracking a policy.
So to open this up to thank you, Angela, and that's a great example of those questions of the board asking itself, what is the right role that we can take here? And sometimes saying, is this even something that we should be involved with, or do we push it back to the school? Do we see how we can support their day-to-day procedures? I'm wondering from the whole panel, are there other questions that you want school boards to ask themselves, or that they can be posing as they look at a particular policy or action that you think would help them to be more trauma informed? Oh, if they would ask themselves this question, I think we've heard so far, right? Asking themselves, have we actually heard from anybody involved what they think about this? That would be a great baseline. But what else? What other things do we wish that boards would be asking?
I think one thing that is coming to mind right now is like, how do I make this process transparent? Because again, sort of the the privilege of sitting on a board, right, is that you're not in schools every day, and that 2 educators on the ground, right, it feels like some mystical castle, you know what I mean, where things just magically happen. But I think that, one thing that we don't do enough of in education across the board is that we don't actually take time to reflect, right? We're so decision focused, and it's always a sense of urgency to our decisions that I don't always feel like that gives us the opportunity to make a sound decision. And so if we can, one, focus, or ask ourselves, right, like, what is our reflection process in this? How are we coming to this decision? And then 2, how are we making kind of what we're doing transparent to the communities in which that we're served, right? Are we, like, is our process public, right? Is there, like, are our meetings public? Do we have a diverse representation of stakeholders on the, or in the room at the time in which we're discussing this particular decision? And so if we can think about transparency and reflection, I think that can help us to build trust among stakeholders in our school districts.
I love all that. And I'm also thinking about how transparency is also connected to, like, I'm thinking about how a lot of school boards, and, I don't know all like the laws connected to it, but I know that like most of them I think are required to publicly, right, like publish your minutes and things like that. But there's a difference to me between like putting your minutes on a website versus actually being transparent in the process, or actively trying to communicate with the community. Because if you've ever tried to read public office meeting minutes, it's different than actually understanding what was talked about at the meeting.
I think another important question beyond like who is harmed by this and who is this decision most like whose interest is it serving is also like, how would we sustain this? What would it look like, or could it look like, worst case and best case scenarios in 10, 15 years? Like here we got all this, Gates money to turn into small schools, and that was another example of beautiful. And then that funding is gone and schools are, smushed back together without the infrastructure or resources to make that happen in a safe, smooth way. And so just what things look like long term as well, I think is important. And who else needs to be a part of this conversation? Who do we bring in to learn from?
Yeah, and I'll take a cue directly from some of the notes that I was just taking, and one of my favorite Alex Venet bits of wisdom, the 4 proactive priorities of trauma-informed decision making. And I love the notion of empowerment, and who or whom are we empowering with this policy? I don't know, and I love that the self-reflection is so important, and not something that boards, in my experience, either are kind of given the time to do, or it's hard, you don't create the time, because again, in my experience, I've run into barriers to that because it is work that's done in the public, and people are fearful of honest vulnerability in open meetings. And that's well, one of the limitations, I think, barriers to like doing really good and better work as a school board, because it's hard to push everyone to just be okay with it. That's not trauma informed. So, but the question of an empowerment, I think, is quite key and often overlooked, because the classic structures in education, in my experience, again, are quite top down, as was mentioned, and there are ways through intentional and thoughtful crafting of policy to start changing that. It really takes a few words in a thoughtful, everything that we write tends to be the superintendent or designee, and like, so that's who you're empowering. And maybe that's who you need to empower in a lot of cases, but there might be, you could probably spread that around a bit,
I think a power analysis is so key to all things in education, but particularly trauma-informed work, because power differentials and misuse of those power differentials often cause trauma. And so I love that question of who are we empowering, and also to maybe look at, I think sort of what you were mentioning at the end there, right? Like, are we continuing to put more and more of the power and decision making on a particular person or group of people? Connected to power and, well, lots of other things. I want to talk about the, I don't know what to call it, trend, reality, situation with school boards across the country right now that have been using their position of power to pass policies or are currently considering policies that are banning books and curriculum and putting expectations on teachers around what they are allowed to read and teach, particularly around racism, gender identity, sexual orientation and expression. And I want to know what you all, we have these school board members here and more who will watch. What do you want these members and teams to hear, know, and do in the context of these actions that have been taken?
I mean,
Like, go ahead.
go ahead. No, like where to start? Go ahead.
I think the thing that first comes to mind, right, is that you are a school board representative, right? Representative meaning that you are not working for yourself. You are representing a collection of people, right, who have indeed entrusted you to make decisions on behalf of the people in which you are representing. I think that is very important to know, right? The decisions that are being made in school boards across the country in regards to banning books and banning curriculum and banning people's livelihoods, essentially criminalizing people's livelihoods that come from identities like mine, right? I think do not represent the students and the teachers who are on the ground every single day. And so when I hear things essentially where people say, right, well, I would just say where these kind of things happen that kind of force kind of people to come out to school board meetings to have these kinds of discussions, right? It really infuriates me, right? Because I know that students were not right, like in mind when these kinds of decisions were made. And so the more, again, that we can get back to the word representative, I think that we'll be able to really make the best decisions. And I know that folks say all the time, right? And I know that we've acknowledged here, and there's folks have acknowledged in the chat, right, that there are a lot of school board members who can honestly say, I don't have classroom experience, right? I don't have a ton of experience in education. And that is great self-reflection, right? For us to acknowledge and admit. And then what, right? And so now what do we do with that, right? Like, you don't have the experience, but you were elected anyway, right? And so now that you know better, you do better, right? And so you put yourself in the shoes of the people in which you're serving every day to make the best decisions for what they need, not what we need.
Yes, and I think, keeping students at the center and heart of school board decisions and policy making. The decisions that you're talking about, Alex, to me, I can't really believe any argument or buy any argument that would say those decisions are being made for the students. Those decisions are being made for the uncomfortable adults, the adults who are racist, homophobic, transphobic. Those decisions are being made to protect those adults from their own discomfort. They're not helping students in any way. And education, public education in particular, is a foundational element in a democratic society, which we still are. And access to information, honest, truthful, complete information, also foundational to participation in a democratic society. So if that's part of what we're preparing children to be, is educated, informed adults, how can you possibly justify limiting their access to information, to options, to opportunities to understand other people? It's I think I'm really proud of the Vermont School Board Association for recently revising their model policy for the selection of library materials. And it's really quite a simple policy in which they name the importance of education in a democratic society. And I think when you bring it, I don't know if that's bringing it down to that level or up to that level, if you're looking at it from up here, whatever direction you want to head in, I think that really answers the question and leaves no room for doubt, really, that it's entirely unacceptable to limit access to education and information and to leave out any of our students in public school education.
Oriana, you want to add anything?
No, yeah.
Oh, did you want to go ahead? Yes, I think, I'll just add, as we're going to transition in a moment to looking at a couple of the Q&A submitted by participants. And, I think just picking up on this question, right, I would go back to the idea that if in trauma-informed education, we want to address harm that's already happened, prevent harm from happening in schools, and we want to create a less harmful world, that if we center that kind of goal, it becomes more clear that we have to evaluate policy decisions like these book bans, curriculum bans, through that lens. And like you said, Angela, it's pretty clear when you look at it through that lens. I could talk to you three all day, but we have just a few moments left for a couple of questions from the participants, Q&A. So let me see what we can
Alex,
talk
I'm
about.
so sorry to interrupt.
Oh, go ahead.
I actually have to leave to go to a school board meeting.
Well, we thank you so much, Angela, for being here. And I'm sure all the members here completely understand. So thank you for being with us. We appreciate you.
Thank you. And thank you, Oriana and Patrick. And I wish you all well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So for Oriana and Patrick, I'm going to give you like the juiciest question on here because I think it's really complicated. So let's see what we can do with it in 5 or 6 minutes. There's a question on here about the balance of increasing security at schools and whether that increase causes or activates trauma. So how do we balance this idea that people are worried about school safety, school security, but also the impact that could have on students?
I'll start by saying, in everything I have read, and my own lived experience speaks to policing and school security not increasing safety or feelings of safety, that there's not a correlation there. I have seen school security officers cause incredible harm in some of the most vulnerable communities that I've worked in. And I deeply believe that we need to start, like that's for after, or, we need to start so many steps prior to that, with how are we creating values and mission of a school that is really in the interest of our young people, in language that our young people can understand, that is congruent with the values of the communities that we're serving, so that they can hear it and feel it and integrate it into their existing worldview. I've been in so many schools that have the either really elementary wording for their school values that don't resonate, or they don't make sense at all. And so I think it's incredibly important that we're creating school spaces that feel safe, as defined by the community. And oftentimes policing is not part of that equation.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it, better myself. I think that, we have some of us have grown up with the lived experience that says that when I see a police officer, in my eyes, in my view, in my story, that means that I feel safer. But that is not the reality of students. And so again, we have to kind of come down and have conversations with folks who are on the ground and say, what would this look like for you, right? And I think that, again, there are many other things that we could be doing to ensure the safety of our young people that does not involve continuous criminalization of them in places where they have to legally be, and that could cause harm. And so we could instead focus on how we could create sort of calm down spaces, or in our schools, we could think about how we could educate or train our teachers and staff members to be trained in restorative practices. We could think about how do we create more opportunities for the arts and for joy and for learning in our schools. We could think about how to retain our staff members, because when there's heavy turnover, there are less and less people for kids to trust with their emotions and their stories, right? And so how do we do that instead? Putting more police officers in schools is a short-term solution, and I don't think it's a good one. And so how do we invest in the long term, because that's what our young people deserve.
Thank you both. And your responses really get at that idea that trauma-informed practice is really about this holistic and long-ranging approach, and not just looking at these quick solutions that might ultimately cause more harm. There's one more question on here I want to get to, but maybe like a speed round if you want to do 1 or 2 sentences. There's a question on here that says, how could we as board members advocate for equity or trauma-informed policies when the only community members that show up or raise their voices are the ones that are against it? How do we encourage or empower community members who support equity and trauma-informed practices to speak up and show up?
The first thing that comes to mind is, and I don't know if this is in the if a board can do this, right? But I think if you have the power and the capability, right, that there should be a student or teacher representative that sits on the board with you. I think that that's first. But then 2, I think that it's important to develop relationships with your staff, right, or with the people that you represent. And so that the only time that people don't, and I think just like making school boards like a part of the education process. How do you invite people, right? Instead of demanding sort of that they come to you, if that makes sense, right? It's like, how to ensure that board members feel like a invitational space, and that is through a relational work. It's not easy, right? It's not easy at all, but it takes some intentionality that I think could definitely pay off in the long run.
I think increasing accessibility, I don't know if this exists now, but multiple ways to share input and commentary on things, that you don't have to like look for parking in our downtown for an hour, to get to the meeting at City Hall, but can the meetings be at different school sites, rotating? Can we submit through email and other ways? Can they be virtual now and we Zoom in on our computers? I'm thinking about that the entire time in this conversation today, is like the educators that are most needed on their campus, that are most committed to like every element of a school's design, really don't have the time to show up to meetings like this. They're pulled in so many directions. They're already working into the night and early in the morning and on weekends. And so I don't have an answer for that, but we as a collective can come up with answers. And I'm sure there are districts that are finding ways to make it more accessible, but that's a real barrier. Yeah.
Well, and it makes me think that in a lot of ways, we keep coming back to the same idea of be in it for the long game. Think about how you're planting roots and really nurturing the community engagement of the board, rather than seeking, the difference between how do we get 10 more people to come and make comment versus how are we actually community engaged so that we regularly have a lot of different folks who feel comfortable and empowered, and that it's accessible to them. I want to thank you two and Angela as well so much. I am going to be thinking about this conversation. I hope that folks who have attended got a ton out of it as well. I tried to take a couple of takeaways, but I was too much paying attention to type while we were chatting. But there's a couple of things here that folks, watching the recording, you can pause here and look, and would also, love for folks to come up with your own takeaways and the notes and quotes that you wrote down. Share those out, share those back with CSBA so that they know what resonated with you. And I just want to say thank you so much for having us, for listening, and for showing up for students and educators every day. We thank you so much.